Okay, order. Welcome everybody to the latest meeting of the Environmental Audit Committee and the third meeting we've had in our house building and environment review that we are doing. We have two panels today. The first is Ben Murphy, the Estate Director from the Duchy of Cornwall, who is currently responsible as the strategic development projects for the Duchy, including Nansledan, that we are, as a committee, very happily going to see it shortly, and has attracted a great deal of attention. So, welcome, Ben. Can I ask you just to introduce yourself and to just explain a little bit about what is different about Nansledan and the approach that you're taking there?
Thank you, and a pleasure to be invited this afternoon. So my name is Ben Murphy. I'm a State Director for the Duchy of Cornwall, as you say, leading our strategic development projects, including Nansledan. Nansledan is an urban extension of the Cornwall coastal town of Duchy, built on Duchy of Cornwall land. It's broadly 10 years and 900 homes into a 30-year, 4,000-home community. It's helping to regenerate and bolster that town of Duchy by delivering local housing needs and jobs across a range of businesses and community uses in the most sustainable way possible. It's the largest development project in Cornwall. It's created in concert with local people, Cornwall Council and other stakeholders. And we use our land as leverage to deliver those local needs. We use local contractors, materials and supply chains. We're delivering 30% affordable homes and a range of other sustainability initiatives. And it's taking a master developer role, which sounds rather grand, but it just means the landowner is taking on the investments in infrastructure in the early years, and it's delivering a master plan community, which is delivering a range of objectives, including 20% biodiversity net gain.
Excellent. And I mean, just talk us through how you integrate nature and biodiversity into the planning and design of Nansledan.
Well, it all starts with that master plan, so the blueprint which makes the land and built for multifunctional, diverse and a very resilient community. So the master plan layers various objectives like the green infrastructure to deliver that biodiversity net gain, integrates a range of landscape solutions that create this additionality. For example, we work with our farm tenant to transform 50 acres of mainly potato fields into Trollope meadows. That's a suitable alternative natural green space, creating wildflower meadows, planting trees, creating woodlands, ponds, and restoring hedgerows, which simultaneously is providing outdoor recreational space. We get about 50,000 people visits a year, according to our recent measuring surveys, draws recreational activity away from sensitive wildlife sites, such as these special area of conservation down the road, provides features that attenuate and clean pollution from both surface water from the development and also surface groundwater from farmland. And it helps Nansledan deliver exactly 24% biodiversity net gain in habitat units and over 40% in hedgerow units, essentially forward funding the BNG for future phases. It's also producing food in terms of the wildflower-fed North Devon beef cattle and a hay crop that's providing income as well for the farm tenant. So broadly, that's very much just really in the planning and design from the outset.
And I mean, in terms of the very kind of environmentally friendly approach that you take there, yes. I mean, is that primarily, a cost, something you're doing, or is it a sort of sales feature that actually helps you to sell the properties? I mean, is this something you would advocate as sort of a profitable process, or is it something you're doing sort of for the sake of the environment at financial expense, do you think?
I think it's about patient capital, essentially. So the role is different. I mean, I can't speak for the whole industry, but I can speak for properly master plan communities like this, which is to say, large strategic developments do require broader shoulders. I mean, by their scale, they have those broader shoulders, but you have to have that patient capital to invest in the early stage in a lot of these infrastructure layers, if you like, both socially, environmentally, and the hard infrastructure, the transport solutions as well. I mean, it requires careful planning. You've got to have the stomach for it. I refer to the patient capital. You've got to work very closely with local stakeholders. Key to this is the strong public-private partnerships. And they help together invest in things. And I mean by that, yesterday I was cutting a ribbon to open the Newquay strategic route, and it's a granite stone bridge that's been jointly invested between Cornwall Council, Network Rail, and ourselves. What that's doing, though, is releasing third-party land for development, and it's also putting the wind in ourselves to invest in Market Street, the first new high street in Cornwall in several hundred years. But the point in all of this is we do need to see an investable return. It's just that we perhaps on larger schemes, we have to have greater time and space to allow ourselves to succeed. So it's about long-term benefit rather than, if you like, the short-term gains.
But would you say, and it's good to hear that, but would you say that, we can hear from a number of panellists shortly who work for in different sectors of the industry, that notwithstanding what you said about it being patient capital, there is profit in taking this kind of approach, or is it something that is likely to always be fairly small scale because of the nature of doing this?
I can't speak for every site, and every characteristic of every site will be different in terms of localities as well. But I can tell you that there's a movement of over 100 landowners, and we get together fairly regularly and all motivated to do something similar to this, so aspire to the same master developer role. I mean, it's different to, if you like, the general market. By that, I refer to the size and scale of these opportunities. It helps when you're in the land already, for sure, but actually we do, and others will have to considerably invest themselves, their own capital, as well as recycle land receipts for those long-term benefits. So every site has its own challenges and opportunities. So it's hard to sort of answer the question directly. I can only speak to what we do, really.
Yeah, and I mean, how do you address concerns that from people who say, well, development inevitably will harm biodiversity? Is it possible to have development that actually adds to the biodiversity of an area rather than takes away from it? Absolutely,
yeah. I mean, it sounds incongruous, but often you can find solutions. You can engineer in these solutions if properly planned and designed and executed. You don't just mitigate harm, but you create these net gains. And that's what I look forward to showing some of the committee members when you come down to Nans Leaden. And of course, seeing is believing in these things. But we've designed in landscape management solutions, we've engineered in the green infrastructure from the outset, and it's delivering those biodiversity net gains. It's engineering, solutions to flood risk and water quality through those nature-based solutions, and that's also providing the access to the green spaces, empowering people to live those healthier, happier, more sustainable lives. That's also making it an attractive place to live and buy a property. And we have orchards, allotments, wildflower meadows for people to enjoy and grow their own food. This is not in a preachy way, it's just encouraging people to live healthier, active, more sustainable lives. And these are becoming desirable places to live. And that's essentially the objective.
And can you tell us about how the site has future-proofed itself through planning against future environmental risks such as flooding, storms, heat waves and other things?
Sure. Yeah. We design and engineer those sustainable urban drainage systems I mentioned with nature-based solutions that tackle flood risk through natural forms of irrigation in the landscape. We have balancing ponds, and they do provide, as mentioned, that amenity and biodiversity solutions as well. One of them that the committee will be able to see is the Chapel Stream wetlands. That actually is the bridge I mentioned yesterday. Bridges over the Chapel Stream wetlands. The Environment Agency have asked to produce a case study on this and how we've managed to improve water quality while actually constructing adjacent to the wetlands themselves. A very sensitive area that's never been farmed before. But the multifaceted benefits from that means we've designed these areas to hold floodwater, the surface water from the development, but also removing pollution before it discharges into the stream itself. We've designed the landscape in a way that enhances biodiversity in public realm. There's through the wetlands, you can walk and boardwalks over here, and there'll be areas to play, and already people are walking and cycling along those, and it's a safe access through to main town of Newquay. So there's other solutions. You mentioned heat waves. Where we paint render on the homes. I mean, it helps in Cornwall that you're surrounded by water on three sides. So it's news if it gets to 25 degrees, but we know what's coming for all of us, and we plant resilient species where possible. We plant trees to help regulate temperature. I mentioned where possible because the challenge has always been utilities that are protected rather than trees. It can be quite difficult, especially on the North Cornwall coast with the prevailing southwesterly winds, to establish as many trees as we like. But we're finding solutions where we're putting utilities into the ducts in the road, and therefore able in our future developments to deliver even more street trees, which helps regulate those temperatures. And for storms, well, I mentioned the sustainable urban drainage systems, and we also use robust materials. Cornish granite is the stuff continents are made of, so pretty robust materials, Cornish slate and such like that will allow those homes to stand the test of time and take those buffers from future storms.
Thank you very much. Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. And Ben, you may have already answered some of this in your previous questions, but I'm really interested in your approach to delivering low-carbon homes and neighbourhoods. So firstly, what challenges have you faced scaling up the delivery of low-carbon homes?
Challenges, I mean, first of all, I say what we do, and then I'll go on to the innovations that have been a challenge. It's always fabric first to reduce heat loss and energy demand from homes. We integrate renewable energy solutions on all phases now, 100% electric, solar PV and heat pumps installed. At the neighbourhood scale, it's mentioned, as you say, that the encouraging sustainable lifestyles and in the mix of uses, the walkable community. The challenge is where we've recognised 50% of the carbon in a home is in its construction. So we've always looked at sourcing low process natural materials, and that's been relatively straightforward in some respects. By that I mean the Cornish granite and slate up the road, and how we've engaged with the quarries. But we've found recycled aggregate blocks, which is from Cornish aggregates. That's 93% recycled aggregate, 7% polymer, which is very helpful in a traditional construction method to reduce carbon again. Where we found the challenge is where we're trying to pioneer bio-based materials, and they're here and they're now. But and I'm talking about hemp insulation, sem-free concrete, tarmac with additives that sequester carbon. Really exciting stuff. But what we find is the certification isn't always there, and the likes of the NHBC are quite slow in coming forward. These things are being assessed properly, and of course they need to meet standard regulations before they're certified. But the lenders, the BBA, BRE, and we'd like to think the Ministry of New Towns could be a real leader in this area, need to be able to support a lot of these innovative materials, because at the moment the cost and supply of them can be challenging, and they need to be established, and then they'll be better supported by the wider industry, or if they are, then they'll help viably scale them up, because at the moment it can be a little bit of a higher bill cost to source some more of the innovation.
What needs to happen to actually get that certification process moving? Has it started, or is there a role for government and regulators in pushing that forward?
It's in some cases it started, and it's quite slow, and we just have to maybe wait for the process to complete. Sometimes it's warranties. You can't sell a home, and a lender wouldn't lend against a home if it doesn't obviously have those warranties. So the NHBC needs to recognise that it has the certification, even if it's novel. It is actually highly sustainable. It should be attractive. And lenders, potentially could also offer green mortgages and such like, because, when you're building highly sustainable homes, low occupational costs, you think it's both stronger covenant strength of the owner occupier, but also a more desirable home, and therefore potentially a premium attached to it. So it's a recognition, I think, all round that this is actually, not a risk. It's actually an opportunity that adds value to the home. I think, but the supply chain, as much as anything, it's how to scale up viably. And in some ways, the industry and regulation could both just look in this direction. And what you'll find is the supply chain will transform. If you said within 5 years, and you've seen it in various other industries, that these sorts of materials, low carbon cement, would be the biggest impact you could have in the construction industry, because cement is the biggest carbon emitter of an industry that emits incredible amount of carbon. And we're told by Ibstock Bricks and others that they have the products, but they don't have the take up from the industry. So therefore it's not at the moment the standard price, but they could transform. So I think new towns could play a really big part here. Yeah. And I've seen it before, both in the projects that we deliver at the Duchy, and I worked in the Olympic Park. You can make real step changes in culture and in the industry. You can really push the dial, as the 2012 Olympics did, on various aspects of innovation.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time and not taking up too much more of my allocated time, but just very briefly, if you wouldn't mind. So first of all, will low carbon homes be more expensive than the average home? And how do homes in London compare to the Future Homes Standard?
The Future Homes Standard is, I mean, we've been part of the, engaged in the Future Homes Leadership Forum and the subcommittees. So I'd like to think we're compliant to pass, but I don't think we've assessed any of the current phases against it. So I can't say for sure, and I'll go away and check that. But we're definitely at current building regs, and we're 97% EPC ratings on average, where I think the industry is 85%. So we're outperforming, and I mentioned we're at the LETI 2030 standard for low carbon construction, which is beyond where the Future Homes Standard is, because it's not being measured yet. And we're also looking at community scale renewable energy solutions, which again is in addition to those assessments. Cost wise, I mean, it's really, the build cost will be a challenge sometimes to our SME house builder margins, because the house prices are dictated by local market conditions, really, in terms of supply and demand. So if the homes come at a premium, it's because they're of quality, and a part of that will be their sustainability. But it's really dictated by the market. It's hard to sit here and say sustainability alone attaches the premium to the house. What it does add at the moment is to the build cost, I can confirm.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Samuel Wilson.
Okay, thanks, Ben. When we look at the different approaches by master developers and traditional builders, I suppose there's a huge difference. Traditional builders want quantity, they want standardisation, they want to have properties which they can build quickly, etc. Whereas, as you have explained to us, when you look at it from master builders' point of view, you're looking at a wider context, etc. How does that impact? You've mentioned the cost, so we'll not go into the cost too much, but how does that impact on the environmental sustainability of the developments, one approach compared to the other?
Again, it's hard to draw a direct comparison, but I would say, the design and execution of the project, aren't mutually exclusive. We deliver about 120 homes per annum on average in both Poundbury and Nansleddon. I think we could achieve 150 to 170 homes per annum in terms of our current construction methods. Beyond that would get our house builders nervous in terms of factoring in the high quality public realm. There's both, and it does though depend, I should say, on construction methods. There could be more modern methods of construction that could speed up the process without reducing quality. But I just know from the house builders that we work with that they're relatively comfortable they can meet our exacting standards at about 120 homes per annum. I think what I would always say is you just need to build more of these types of communities to deliver at scale and increase pace, and potentially find, maybe more modern methods to increase the delivery. But a lot of it also relates to the absorption rate locally, which is how many homes can be absorbed in the local market at one particular time or per annum. So, we deliver a range of tenures, and we like to see private rented and retirement homes, as well as affordable and private rented. So if you at least take a multi-tenure approach, you build some diversity into the market, and hopefully that means demand, in good times and bad, is pretty resilient. That's at least what we found.
You emphasised, from the environmental sustainability point of view, the public realm and the other aspects of that, open spaces, etc. So yes. In terms of the longer term maintenance of that,
yes.
Is that maintained through management companies which the owners and the renters have to pay into?
Yes.
And what kind of costs does that impose on homes, and also how do you ensure the quality? Because we've all seen in housing estates in our own constituencies where that when you start off, it's lovely, it looks great in the pictures, it looks great in the first couple of years, and then it becomes
yes.
all very tatty. What's the cost of maintaining that kind of public realm, and secondly, who bears the cost of that?
Well, I think you've probably hit on the challenge, actually, which is in the early years, because we've delivered so much green infrastructure, the Duchy has decided to subsidise the maintenance cost. Now, we knew that was going to be the case because we cap the estate charge, which residents have levied upon them, to CPI, cost inflation, to make sure that the alternative wouldn't happen, which is that they would be saddled with a large bill for green infrastructure that we've decided to forward deliver early. So we've banked, if you like, a lot of future biodiversity net gain for the benefit of early residents, but it doesn't mean that they're on the hook to pay for the whole. Now, as we scale up, because we're 10 years in, nearly 1,000 homes in, it'll soon get to the point where actually the estate charge revenues will cover the cost of the wider maintenance for that community, and eventually it's going to be 4,000 homes. The estate charge itself is very comparable to the market. It's about £250 per annum. If you factor in that these homes are highly sustainable with low energy costs, then actually the overall occupational costs here are preferable to the average house. Residents sit on the management companies, so they see very transparently where the money's going, and residents can also therefore vote if they want to up or reduce maintenance and therefore standards, you might say, if they think that the costs are becoming too high. But we just thought the fairest way of dealing it was setting it at a level that was affordable. We don't have any ground rents, never have. They're at a peppercorn if there's a leasehold property. So residents know, eyes wide open when you move in, that you are paying on average at the moment £250 per annum, which is pegged to CPI. So it's very much part of their future planning.
Okay. And if this was being done by a traditional builder, would you expect that they would put in the kind of subsidy that you're talking about for your open spaces and your green areas?
I mean, I can't speak on behalf of individuals. I think or organisations or sectors really. I can only say for us, £40,000-50,000 per annum when building at scale like this, which is the cost that we're subsidising, is something that we decided was worth paying. And indeed, there was no alternative because we had capped it at CPI. So we decided to move ahead and do it. What we think is that it's actually benefiting the people and adding value to the overall estate and wider objectives of what we're doing. So, it's worked for us. I mean, it was, in our sense, we satisfied ourselves. The business case was worth doing.
I mean, you're a new town. How do you see new towns fitting into the broader picture of dealing with the housing crisis that we have in the United Kingdom? Is it peripheral, or do you see new towns being central to dealing with that problem?
I mean, I'm an optimist about these things, and I think of the fact that we still talk about new towns. I was up at Hatfield House, as mentioned, with about 80 other major landowners, and we were talking about the previous growth in new towns, in Hertfordshire and so forth. And I would say they could become a clarion call. I think they're part of the solution. I appreciate they won't deliver all of the housing needs, but I think I made reference to it earlier. But I was lucky enough to work on the Olympics when I was a younger surveyor, and I saw how that really changed culture in the industry, whether it be on health and safety, women in construction, local employment, zero waste to landfill, sustainability, accessibility for people in terms of the Olympic Games, because the scale of the contracts and opportunity is such that you can demand higher, better and more innovative things. So I think new towns can become that clarion call for the wider industry. So I think they're absolutely worthwhile and part of the solution myself.
Do you think that the decision on their location will be driven by economic factors, local availability of land? In your case, of course, the Duchy of Cornwall made the land available. What do you see as the main factors determining if it's decided to go down the route of a new town?
Yes.
And is there a danger that you just simply choose what's economically best and maybe not environmentally best?
I'm fascinated to know what the decisions are going to be for that very reason. I mean, I think strategic location and context are incredibly important. The landscape character of the place should inform the master plan. I think landscape architects could make good master planners of new communities. We have land that's generally agricultural land that sits around towns that have grown and historically just not got in the way of local planning decisions and allocations of land. And of course, in the last 50, 60 years, more actively managed those developments ourselves as a major landowner to make sure that, what's promised to the community is what's delivered. But we urban extensions like we have delivered are more efficient. I mean, still done well like we are. We're delivering local needs. We're not a parasite on the town, but it's more efficient than starting afresh. But scale and proximity to economic areas, existing transport connections, I think the sheer scale of the town will probably answer that question. It would need to be a sufficient scale to justify a new settlement. But I think it's a very difficult question to answer without looking at the details. I'm fascinated to see what the decisions will be.
Thank you very much. Alison Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, Ben. We're very much looking forward to coming to Nansleden in a couple of weeks. So I'm trying to understand to what extent the Duchy of Cornwall's backing enabled you to pursue your sustainable development aspirations. And I also noted that you mentioned in your answer to a previous question that you felt that the fact that the Duchy of Cornwall owned the land was quite a significant factor, and I presume that played into, you mentioned, returns as well in your terms of your development profit. So what sort of profitability does the Duchy look for, and how do you think that gives you maybe a slight advantage in terms of the viability compared to a developer who didn't own the land in the first place and was coming into it afresh? Would you be able to give us a little bit of insight into that?
Sure, absolutely, and very much looking forward to hosting you in Nansleden soon. The land is part of the equation, but it's not the whole. We produced with, I think it was 27 sites were assessed by ACOM and Knight Frank as part of a report that was shared with the ministry, included Nansleden and others across a range of different landowners, and I think Homes England and a couple of local authorities shared results. And it showed the sheer cost of infrastructure in Section 106, both on-site and off-site costs, were the main challenge to viability. We take that patient capital approach I mentioned, and take Nansleden as an example. It won't be scheduled to break even until 2032. First spade in the ground was 2015. The inquiry by design to guide the master plan was 2005. £7 million on planning and design fees between 2005 and 2012. Consent means that you do have to recycle, yes, the land receipts and put your own capital into these developments. So it's a good starting point in the land, but nevertheless, it takes a concerted long-term investment. We, though, as the Duchy of Cornwall, have to achieve a rate of return that's commensurate with the marketplace. So, for example, we underwrite all speculative development projects, including Nansleden, with a benchmark 15% total return on our investment. So Nansleden, I'm pleased to say, continues to perform against that. It's teetering on. Obviously, it was started in different times and right now is more challenging in the marketplace just because of the cost of inflation. Long-term rental investments are benchmarked around 10%. Again, these are standard industry benchmarks. So, we operate and measure our performance against market expectations, and indeed we have to. This isn't a sort of a philanthropic endeavour by any stretch. The difference is myself and the team being given the space and time to succeed. So it is that what I refer to as patient capital.
Yeah. And when you mentioned the returns on the development, the 15%, is that on all your development costs? Just so that we can record that correctly in our...
Yes, and that includes, I think, only agricultural land value, but that includes all total development costs and cost of finance. Yeah.
So as far as the Duchy is concerned, there's no actual subsidy being provided, just to be clear, and the other developers of scale who could take the same patient capital approach, there's no reason why they could not undertake similar projects in your view?
Yeah, the one qualification though I would say to that, and I should, is of course there's lots of detail we can talk about when you visit as well, but the strong public-private partnerships. So Cornwall Council have been a really good, strong strategic partner. Our Section 106 costs and obligations aren't as high as many others because they knew the challenges we face. And we both knew that our biggest commitment was affordable housing, which is why if we ran a viability appraisal, we wouldn't have delivered any affordable housing back in the day. Cornwall is, and Duchy is one of the poorest parts of the country if you look at the indices of deprivation. So we took a concerted effort together to settle on the Section 106 that was reasonable at the time, to commit to 30% affordable housing from the outset, and didn't run a viability appraisal. And it's transformed over time as we've added value. So at the outset, it wasn't looking too great. But also, we've had about 40% of the funding for the schools from a free schools programme. The Newquay strategic route I mentioned earlier, we put in 7 million and 25 million came from Cornwall Council Homes England. Those things have put the wind in our sails and allowed us to invest significantly more, 43 million today. But the point is, it's been a public-private partnership and a co-investment, and the public sector has kind of provided seed funding, and we've provided the lion's share and continue to. And I think that's an incredibly important aspect to highlight.
Yeah. Would you have any recommendations how developers who don't have such deep pockets, deep resources, and that long-term patient capital approach, how they could still build the sustainability and biodiversity into housing developments? Would you have any recommendations around that?
Yeah, for I think the scale of development, I mentioned before, gives you broader shoulders. I remember working in Olympic Park and where we achieved those things like zero waste to landfill, which you can move waste around the site and whatnot. So scale of development gives you greater opportunity. Doesn't necessarily mean they have the access to the capital. I think, and I've mentioned this to the ministry, I know that Homes England wants to get more involved in this area and truly to be a master developer itself directly, but also support the industry through infrastructure loans, because it's the big ticket infrastructure items that are a huge challenge. And I think in our case as well, if it's jointly funding some of those solutions, but with strings attached to hit those sustainability standards and their other social objectives and environmental objectives, of course, that you wish to stipulate alongside any loan or financial support. I think that's really what I would say, both respectfully to yourselves and anyone else who wishes to know.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Can I just check one figure that it was really relation to Alison's question? Ben, you said that when you calculated your 15% return, that was based on agricultural value of the land. Is that right? If it had been based on development value of the land, what would the return have been?
I don't know the answer off the top of my head, and that goes back to the point that yes, we have converted agricultural land at the beginning of this process, and that's why genuinely it helps to own the land in the first place. But when if you're looking for a sort of more, I'd say, objective analysis, then the report that was done called the Viability of Master Plan Communities with Knight Frank and ACOM that looked at 27 sites up and down the country across different geographic areas, I think is a really good sample, because it then it sort of regularized land value within it, and it looked at all the other costs, and it showed that land, whether it was 100k per acre or 200k per acre, it didn't make the bigger difference. The bigger difference was the overall infrastructure costs, and those infrastructure costs didn't benefit from any economies of scale, because once you got over 5,000 homes, you then ended up with bigger ticket items like secondary schools rather than just primary schools and so forth. There's a fascinating summary on the report, and it shows you really where the viability challenges are, and they are around infrastructure, especially off-site infrastructure costs, because there's been a significant underinvestment in infrastructure over many years, and sometimes these schemes come forward and the local authority understandably is trying to then, or other agencies are trying to see greater investment, not just within the community, but also externally around the town. And that's where these schemes, I think, are becoming quite challenged.
Well, thank you very much. So thank you, Mr. Murphy, for that evidence. We all very much look forward to getting down to see you on site, and I should inform you, if there's any more ribbon cutting, you'll have some very qualified and experienced ribbon cutters on hand. No, we look forward to seeing you, and we very much appreciate the evidence that you've given us this afternoon. So with that, I will bring this first panel session to an end. Order.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Order. So we come to the second panel of the day. This is hearing from a number of different developers. I have to start the session by thanking you very much for attending. I have to say it was not easy for us to find house building companies who were enthusiastic to come and hear from us, to speak to us, and so we very much welcome the fact that you gentlemen were willing to come along. I'm going to start by asking each of you to just introduce yourself, your organisation, and speak very briefly about the sector of the marketplace that you are in, and then we'll get on to the opening question from Sarah Gibson. So if I could start with you, Mr. Spearing.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Ashley Spearing. I'm Managing Director of Regeneration Planning and Policy at Berkeley Ventures, part of the Berkeley Group. We're the largest brownfield urban regeneration developer in the UK. We deliver 10% of London's new and affordable homes. I guess the point I'd like to make first off really is that we are a specialist in brownfield. So 93% of our housing delivery is on brownfield sites like former gasworks, industrial sites, things like that. Close to existing infrastructure and transport generally. So my answers will be sort of specific to brownfield land. We agree that both brownfield and greenfield and grey belt are necessary to deliver try and deliver the target, the 1.5 million homes. But actually we need all types of homes, so brownfield particularly important there. We have been pioneering biodiversity net gain since about 2017 voluntarily. So the 57 sites we put into planning since 2017 all achieve a biodiversity net gain of at least 10%. So that's something that we've been championing voluntarily on our sites. Largely because with a lot of those large brownfield urban sites that are closed off to the public, you can bring the public and nature back into those communities. So that's our focus, really.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you. It's Kenny Duncan, Managing Director of Strategic Land at Crest Nicholson. So Crest Nicholson are one of the volume house builders, medium-sized volume house builders. Our focus is principally on greenfield development. We're a company that's been around for around 80 years. We are similar to many of our peers within the house building sector in terms of greenfield development. So I think many of the challenges that we face and many of the opportunities that we face would be shared by many of our peers within that sector.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Thompson.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So Chris Thompson, I'm founder and one of the directors of Citu. We're a Yorkshire-based SME house builder, but really focusing on regeneration of brownfield sites with a particular emphasis on low and zero carbon communities. We've been on a journey to vertically integrate a MMC product into our business to help unlock and facilitate the development of those buildings.
Excellent. If we could start, Sarah Gibson, please.
Well, first of all, let me just add my thanks to those of the Chair for your time today. It's really nice to be able to hear from developers, because I sometimes think that's not a voice that often gets heard well. So just to sort of open the questions, I'm really interested to hear how you feel the planning reforms are going to help. And this is a question to all of you, really, is what your response is to the government's revised approach to planning. And what parts of the planning reforms would you say that you welcome to start with? Shall I start with Kenny?
Yeah, really positive. We've had a difficult environment in the last period of time, and the policy changes that the government have introduced have gone as far as they possibly could in trying to unlock some of the problems that the planning system has been wrestling with in recent times. The revised standard method, the 5-year housing land supply reintroduction, and the new approach to grey belt in particular would be the three highlights that we would focus upon. The introduction of biodiversity net gain, which came around about the same time, is welcomed as well by the development industry. I think sometimes there's a gap between perception and reality in terms of our approach to biodiversity and our attitude towards biodiversity. Biodiversity and public open space and green infrastructure are a fundamental part of the placemaking agenda that we seek to deliver. And whether it's a big site, whether it's a little site, whether it's an enormous site like the one you were hearing about previously, the approach to delivering biodiversity, delivering public open space, delivering green infrastructure is right at the heart of what we're trying to do. And I think it's important to say, from a contextual point of view, that delivering biodiversity and delivering ecological enhancements is not in itself new. Biodiversity net gain as a policy tool is new, but we have been delivering biodiversity improvements as a requirement of national policy for around about 10 years, and even going back beyond that, far beyond. I'd take an example delivered by Crest in 2011, I think we started, Tadpole Garden Village to the north of Swindon. Possibly Swindon is not the most glamorous location to deliver these types of things, but
I'd just like to warn you that it borders my constituents, so before you say anything else.
I did live there, so I feel capable of saying that. It's not the highest value part of the country, so if you can achieve what we achieved at Tadpole Garden Village in a location like that, then it is replicable. And it is replicated across many parts of the country and across many house builders. It's not just something that I'm claiming for Crest. The second thing I would say is the reforms proposed through the Planning and Infrastructure Bill then stepped into the space that policy couldn't deal with by looking at things like nutrient neutrality, water neutrality, recreational impact zones, effectively the things that are affected by the habitats regulations. And I think the more strategic approach that is proposed in that bill, if it's followed through as it's laid out, should make a serious difference both to the ability to deliver housing and to protect the environment and deliver biodiversity improvements. And there's no good reason why the two things can't be delivered in step. There is not a tension between those things in the planning system in the way that it's sometimes portrayed. And then finally, I think it's really worth highlighting this. It's pretty clear from what the government has said that they have a long-term commitment to the principle of plan-led strategic development. And it's to their credit that stepping into this space now, that they've allowed for a short-term solution to get the situation moving, to take place without actually jumping straight to that strategic solution immediately. Because if they had done so, it is inevitable that it would have slowed down housing delivery. So those, I think, would be the three things I'd highlight as the main benefits and main reasons why we're positive about what's happened.
There'll be other questions, so I'll just
Sure.
quickly move on to Ashley, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course, thank you. So I won't repeat Kenny's answers there. Hugely positive start, renewed focus on delivery, reintroduction of housing targets, really important, grey belt, green belt, brownfield, obviously. I think getting support into local planning authority teams, resource support, national scheme of delegation, allowing authorities to set their own planning fees, we think is important, training for planning committees. These will all help planning applications get through the system. The Housing Accelerator, the New Towns Task Force, all positive. But I think overarching over that is really is the tone and the mission being clear that we want to deliver that 1.5 million homes.
Mm. And Chris, finally.
Thank you. I've probably got different reasons, but similar enthusiasm for the changes. The three that I picked out really are about the design focus, increased emphasis on design quality, and I think that's sometimes overlooked in a push for quantity of housing that we need to build. But the typology, the quality of the place that we build is central to how those communities function and the outcomes that people ultimately experience in living there. So that's a really welcomed aspect from our perspective. I think the enhanced environmental policies generally are all very positive and are addressing the crisis that we have in terms of climate change, but also the biodiversity, and the streamlining of the planning process as well, which has been mentioned.
Yes, I mean, the point about improved quality of housing obviously makes a huge difference to acceptability and buy-in by local communities, doesn't it? And I think the second two questions I had, I can kind of pull together slightly, and perhaps I'll go the other way around, start with Chris this time, which is, what do you feel the barriers are going to be for achieving these targets? And how do we make sure that the housing targets that you all thought were a good change and pleased that they've been brought back, but how are we going to achieve those targets without damaging the environment?
So tackling both bits of those questions. I suppose the barriers really that we see is about some of the demand really at the moment. That we're in a difficult demand environment, and stimulating that would be really helpful. In terms of the conflict between development and the environment, I think intrinsically doing anything has a carbon impact, but actually, so that's there's an acceptance of that. But actually, working within those parameters, we can actually achieve really high quality environmental schemes. It depends largely on where we're building them. Obviously, we have a default to brownfield land, and there's a lot of opportunities on brownfield land. And I'm speaking from a regional perspective here because we are based in Yorkshire, and that brownfield allocation isn't evenly spread throughout the country. But certainly, there's a huge potential with brownfield land development, and actually, we measure both all three of embodied carbon, operational carbon, but also the sort of consequential carbon of the carbon that is impacted from the places that you build, where you're building those, the amenities that are actually woven into those. And all three of those are really important. And by building the right type of properties in the right places, we can create, we can do that absolutely hand in glove with environmental goals.
I think housing and the environment, I think they work together. Certainly with brownfield development, we've talked about low carbon homes. We can absolutely do those. I think 93% of our homes are already EPC level B. When the grid is decarbonised, nearly all of our homes will effectively be net zero. On the operational element, you still have the embodied carbon. Since 2020, we've been working on embodied carbon. We set science-based targets as our sort of response to 1.5 degrees and that challenge. We've done 53 assessments on 53 sites now in terms of the embodied carbon.
If I can just interrupt you for a second, just remind you, the questions about barriers. What are the barriers to achieving these targets? You're all tremendously positive, which is lovely. We're not actually hearing that there's any problems, in which case we can pack up and go home. But have you actually got any complaints you want to make about the system as it is at the moment, or the recommendations the government are making?
Okay, so we think the mission and the tone in terms of getting delivery going and trying to reduce some of the barriers is hugely positive. Actually, I think the challenges now probably sit outside of planning. So in London, for example, we've seen the BCIS index has moved by 47% since 2016, which is causing a huge impact on build costs. We've got more regulation in terms of fire safety. So actually what that leads to is that it's harder to make schemes stack, and that then comes down to priorities locally, really. So what's the most important thing locally? Is it the affordable housing? Is it a new school locally? So some of the routes through that are things like using Section 106, not CIL. CIL is often charged before anything else. It's mandatory. Before affordable housing, the CIL comes out. It's not something you can negotiate. People don't often know locally where the CIL is spent. So flipping to using 106 instead of CIL allows more local decision making, more local support. So that's a big thing that can help locally. We think promoting good density near to transport links on brownfield, again, is another route to that prioritisation. Helping the housing associations, because at the moment, housing associations have got a real challenge. So how can we get the housing associations back in the market to buy the affordable housing? Making the system go faster. So if we do get to planning committee, how do we get on site as quickly as possible?
I'm going to stop you there because that's kind of drifting away a little bit further from the revisions of the planning process into sort of perhaps some other things. And just before I come to you, Kelly, because something perhaps more relevant to you in terms of housing targets is that one of the issues that, and as you know the area, that happens in rural areas such as Wiltshire and Swindon, is that because of the housing targets, when we had them previously, we then found a situation where speculative development was happening, which there was a huge amount of resistance to because it wasn't the sites in the local plan. Do you feel that that happens again when we've now reintroduced housing targets, and therefore we're going to get more of this sort of slightly more speculative development, which will again be more harmful for the environment?
There's a number of parts to that question. If I just take them in turn. I think you're right to say that when local authorities don't plan and deliver the housing that is required for the area, and there is, if you like, the carrot and the stick. So the carrot is the local plan, and the plan-led system, which I think everybody is supportive of, industry, profession, from a democratic point of view. It's important that plan-led system is the way to go. But when the plan-led system doesn't deliver, and we sit here today in a situation where 75% of authorities don't have a 5-year land supply, and 80% of authorities don't have an up-to-date local plan, then the only way to get housing delivered is through the 5-year land supply test. But the 5-year land supply test is not a situation where you don't have a 5-year land supply, therefore it's open season and housing can be built everywhere. That isn't how it works. So just before I came in, because I anticipated this question might come up, I had a look at the planning decisions that have been refused in the last 6 months since changes to national planning policy came into being. And I found 3 of 12, and I didn't look for very long, where there was no 5-year land supply, but for reasons other than 5-year land supply, there was still a refusal. Now, on 2 of those reasons that I looked at directly yesterday, the reason was because it's too small, because it's not the right place for development, because it would be harmful. So I'm not as concerned as some people are that a consequence of the 5-year land supply test is that all of a sudden you get development in unsustainable locations, and that directly leads to environmental harm. I don't think that is what was happening when the 5-year land supply test was in pre-2023. The suspension of the 5-year land supply test simply brought the planning system to a standstill because there was no consequence to authorities not delivering on their requirements. And if you don't want to believe me, read the Competition and Markets Authority report into the planning situation and the reasons for the delays. Coming back to the question that was initially asked, I think I do have some concerns to help you with. If I deal first with the can we do this without causing harm to the environment? Absolutely, because the environment is afforded the highest status of protection in the planning system. The biodiversity net gain requirements, the habitats regulations are enshrined in law, and everything else that we're talking about is enshrined in policy. So they have greater weight. So the protections for the environment are already there. The barriers, the biggest barrier to delivering 1.5 million homes in this Parliament is the pace of the planning system. And that is not to say that it is the fault of planners, because I don't think it is. There are not enough of them. To be slightly flippant about it, sometimes they read more like hostages with Stockholm Syndrome than they do the passionate advocates for good quality development that they were 10 years ago. And I think that's a consequence of a reduction in resource in the public sector that is really harmful. It's some research by Savills suggests that's down by 59% between 2010 and 2020. So it's hardly surprising that they're unable to resource it in that way. The thing that is exercising us most, I think, at the moment across the sector is a lack of coordination and cooperation between the different arms of government and the infrastructure providers. Because without that cooperation and coordination, we find ourselves frequently in situations, and the best example I can give you is a nutrient neutrality one, where there is absolutely nothing we can do. We can't solve that problem. There's nothing we can do to solve it. Since, in the last 2 years, not only is it nutrient neutrality, we're starting to see water supply is not there. There is no capacity to take for a wastewater discharge. We're being asked to assess coastal flooding as if there were no coastal defences in 100 years' time with a 40% allowance for climate change. That's not reasonable. So those sorts of things are probably the most significant barriers to getting the houses built within this Parliament. And just coming back to something that Chris said, this session is focused mostly on planning. But aside from planning, on the demand side, the gap between average incomes and average house prices, particularly in the south of England, has become so significant that it's a real barrier to entry for first-time buyers. And first-time buyers are what creates churn in the market, which means one person moves somewhere else who moves somewhere else. And it's not an easy one to wrestle with. First, Help to Buy was not popular politically on every front, and I've heard it described as heroin for the development industry. And I do understand those political points of view. But the pragmatic reality of the situation is it's difficult for people to buy houses. And if people can't afford to buy houses, it's very difficult to build them.
Thank you.
That's a good point.
We've talked there about the difficulties getting planning approval. We also, I suspect each of us as members of Parliament have had situations in our local communities where developers have achieved planning approval and then for years have not actually built on those sites. Maybe start with you, Mr. Spearing. Can you give us an indication as to why developers who have planning approval, I think last count, there's over 1 million houses or 1 million units that have planning approval have never been built. Why is it that developers get approval but then don't build?
I think a number of investigations have looked at this question over the years, starting with Dame Kate Barker back in 2003, the Letwin Review most recently, and the CMA. None of those investigations really concluded that issue. The idea that developers sit on land and don't develop them, certainly in brownfield, just doesn't work commercially. These sites are hugely capital intensive. It doesn't make commercial sense to invest all of that into a site and in the ground and then sit on it. So that isn't our experience as a brownfield developer. Quite often the reason why some sites don't come forward after getting planning permission is that regulations changed, or you've got a huge inflation issue. So in London, as I said, since 2016 we've seen 47% rise in the BCIS. And then you've got things like fire safety that have come in recently, which for good reason, it means that people have got to go back to planning to change those plans to deal with new regulation, after which time inflation has moved on and things are different and maybe the plans don't quite work anymore. So I think there are good reasons for those sites that maybe haven't started, but in the main, we don't see that as something that in brownfield that makes that much commercial sense. Certainly in London today, we're seeing some issues with the building safety regulator, where there are about 18,000 homes stuck in the system with planning and that don't have Gateway 2 approval. So I don't necessarily think it's always for planning reasons. Sometimes it can be for reasons outside the planning environment.
Yeah. So I mean, you say it doesn't make sense on brownfield sites. Does it make more sense on greenfield sites?
No, it doesn't. This is a question that I've had to answer a number of times in my career. The only discussion we've ever had as a house builder about the pace of development is how we can go quicker. It's never about how we can go any more slowly. To get to a position where you've got a planning permission, you do it one of two ways. You either buy the land, in which case you've got costs sunk. You have to go, and then you have to go through the planning system. And by the time you get there, you've got quite a substantial amount of work in progress. Or you do it, as I tend to do it, on the longer-term strategic sites, where you enter an option agreement with a landowner, and once you've got the planning permission, you then negotiate to buy the land either in whole or on phases. Promoters do it slightly differently. They do broadly the same as I just described, but when they get to the end of the process, they sell it on the open market to a house builder. There's no commercial incentive to go any slower than you have to, because you are servicing the cost of that work in progress all the time. That's not to say, as you rightly identify, that sites don't get planning permission and then don't progress. Most of the time that is the case. It'll be because there's some form of deliverability issue. There's a problem with access to a service or a facility. There's a flood risk zone. There's a difficulty with the technical approval. It might take a long time to get through the reserve matters process, or it may take a long time to buy the land because there's a disagreement over the price of it. But I would say categorically and confidently, and as Ashley rightly identifies, there's been 4 reports into this in the last 20 years. It started with Letwin, then it was Lyons, then it was Barker, and most recently the Competition and Markets Authority concluded very clearly that there was no evidence to suggest that house builders were land banking for that purpose, and that the reason for the delays was principally the planning system. I would add to that deliverability and the time it takes to draw down land. But the concept of land banking is a deliberate attempt for the house building sector to slow down the delivery of houses. I just don't recognise at all. The 1 million homes that are with planning permission and have not been built will largely be on multi-phase sites, which take a long time to come forward, such as the development down in Cornwall that you were hearing about previously. The example I gave you earlier, Tadpole Garden Village, we delivered that pretty quickly. It took us 10 years to build out around about 2,000 houses. But it does take time to deliver multi-phase schemes, and that's the reason for that.
I mean, I hear what you've both said there, and you gave some examples there, Mr. Duncan, as to reasons why things might get delayed. But your evidence sort of stands in contrast to what many of us see in our communities, where we see these sites, and years later, nothing's ever been built. And I accept you've given us some of the reasons, but I mean, it seems sort of logical to us to think that developers might think, well, if we make too much housing available in a certain area, if the sort of supply outstrips demand, it's going to be pushing prices down. If we can keep people desperate for houses, then that's going to keep the price high. Are you saying that those sort of thought processes really aren't considered in the industry? You're not thinking, well, if we bring 50 to 100 houses forward every year, then there won't be an oversupply. But if we brought 500 forward in a 1 year period, it might push the price down. Is that not?
I can honestly say I've never heard anybody say that in the organisation I work in. I've never said it. I can't say that anybody anywhere at some point in history has never thought that. However, as a matter of principle, the cost of servicing the debt, and it is always high 6 or 7 figure sums to service, far outweighs any kind of consideration like that. And from a slightly more pragmatic point of view, the job lifetime of a managing director of a house builder, it's not that long, and they are under pressure to deliver annual results by the half year, by the month, by the year. The idea that they would slow that production down for some kind of perceived benefit in the future at the risk of their own job, it just doesn't bear contact with the reality of working in the sector.
Okay. Mr. Thompson, how could the relationship between planning approvals and housing completion be improved?
Well, I think I was trying to relate this to our own experiences as to where we could have made more progress on sites that we've got planning. And I think it does come down to one of two things. Sometimes the planning process, and we've got examples where this takes many years to get through from initial concept through to delivery. And when you're delivering in housing speculatively in an urban context, sometimes that market take-up changes during the course from when you started the process to actually when you've got it. And there's a need to sort of tweak that planning consent because the topology or the tenure that you're actually targeting at the beginning is no longer quite as relevant. So I suppose that's one of the reasons why we can see it slowing down. And then the other bit is about viability. It's just and that's been mentioned before by Ashley, just about the various changes. And I'm seeing a lot of that currently with Building Safety Act, with buildings over 18 metres suddenly becoming no longer viable with all the changes that are needed to be in them, and having to revisit planning applications to say, well, actually, how do we change that density? How do we change the mix of building topologies on the site? And certainly that's some of our experiences that we've had. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just going to bring Barry Gardner in briefly, and then we'll go to Olivia Blake.
Very grateful, Chair. I've been looking at your annual reports, and if I go to you, Mr. Spearing, in 2023, your current annual report, the 24 annual report, said you built 4,637 properties. Some of those, about 65 of them, were joint venture. Average price 608,000, making a pre-tax profit of 130,000 on every home. But the figure that really made me think that the chair's got his finger on you here was what was called the future growth margin in land holdings in 2023, because that was £7.629 billion. So I looked up the note at the end of on page 214, I think it is, of your annual report.
I'm looking forward to this question.
And it said that this represents the management's risk-adjusted assessment of the potential gross profit for each of the group's sites, including the proportionate share of its joint ventures, taking account of a wide range of factors, including current sales and input prices, the economic and political backdrop, the planning and regulatory regime. This is exactly what the chair's just been talking about, isn't it? So that you're making an assessment of the profit that you can make on the land that you've already acquired, and that is then, you will then, because it's a risk assessment, you will then adjust the flow of properties coming out to make sure that you maximise that return, will you not? I mean, the chair's got you spot on, hasn't he?
So just to explain that, we've got 32 complex brownfield regeneration sites. Those sites are built out in phases, often brownfield, often complicated. You don't go and if you've got an 80-acre brownfield site, you don't go and remediate the whole 80 acres in one go. You don't go and put all the infrastructure in for 80 acres in one go. You can't get to the end of the parcel until you get to the start. So I think the numbers you're quoting there reflect that these are very, very large brownfield complex sites.
But that's not the issue here, is it? The issue here is you are making, by your own admission in your annual report, a risk-adjusted assessment of the potential gross profit for each of those sites, and you do so taking into account the economic and political backdrop, the planning and regulatory regime, and the sale and input prices. So this is not something, oh, well, it just so happens. You actually plan this. You plan it and you make an assessment of the profit, the gross margin that you can make on each of those land holdings. You know, you're running a business. I'm not saying you shouldn't be making an assessment. I'm not saying you shouldn't make that judgment, because your shareholders will no doubt demand it. But don't tell the chair that you're not doing it, please.
I don't think that's what I'm saying. I'm saying...
Both of you said that.
No, I think we're saying that these sites are complicated and that you can't build... so if we build 4,000 homes a year, that's 4,000 homes a year across all of those sites. We can't build all of those homes and sell all those homes in the same year. That's the issue that you're identifying, is that these are 15 and 20 year
you will do so
sites.
To maximise the profitability, the profit that you can make on each of those sites. You will do that. And that's why you make the assessment of the economic and market conditions. It's precisely why you look at the sales and the input prices. It's so that you can maximise the profit. If you didn't, surely you would then come back to me and say, well, I'd be breaking the law because my shareholders would take me to court because I'm not maximising the value for them.
I think you're valuing a whole portfolio.
No, you are.
Yes, but
it is. It's the gross margin in the land holdings.
Yes, but that's because they are large, complex sites. You can't have all of that value, that margin in 1 year. That a lot of that margin is 10, 15 years.
Not saying you get it in 1 year. Yeah. What I'm saying is you're using that, you're making that valuation, that judgment, and you're using all the market conditions to make that risk assessment. And you then manipulate it to make sure that you're making the maximum value on each site at the right time. If you didn't, you wouldn't be a very good company, would you?
We'll move on. Olivia Blake.
Okay, moving on to biodiversity net gain then. Can I ask both the people in the room, because I think it's most relevant to your organisations, what the biggest concerns are about implementation and delivery of biodiversity net gain? Starting with Mr. Spearing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think some of, I mean, as Kenny talked about as well, biodiversity net gain is something we've been doing for a while now. We've done it on the last 57 sites that we put into planning. We are finding that we can achieve a 10% biodiversity net gain. 10% is quite an arbitrary measure. The 10% really depends on what you start with as a baseline. So if the baseline of the site is very low, then making a 10% gain on that is a lot easier than if you start at a very, very high baseline. 10% actually, it's quite hard. In actual fact, you can make a 10% gain on one site and a 100% gain on another site and have the same habitat value on both, because it's actually about the gain. I think the areas where we find it difficult in terms of net gain sometimes are thinking about the long-term management of that, and that's just something that we're getting to grips with, where you have to put a 30-year plan in place for that. And also sometimes you get habitats that are very hard to replace. There's something called open mosaic habitat we get on brownfield land in London, which is something that pops up when you least expect it, usually when you're part way through a remediation of a site. It's actually quite hard to replace. So we end up having to purchase credits for off-site to replace that. Generally, we like to deliver that biodiversity gain on-site within the site, because we think that's the best landscape-led solution. So I think the challenges that we face at the moment are really about measurement and making sure that that's consistent. And I think obviously we try to do the best biodiversity net gain we can on every site, taking into account local species and local preferences and things like that. But I think the danger here is that we run before we can walk on this as an industry. So I think that there has been a step change to 10%, in law. So I think the industry now needs to get used to that now, and we need to embed it in the management systems for those sites. But in our view, achieving that net gain is not a barrier to housing delivery and growth.
Yeah, I agree. Biodiversity net gain is something that we are supportive of, and I think every one of the volume house builders is committed to delivering 10% net gain in their corporate strategies. I think whether or not the biodiversity net gain is delivered on-site or off-site is less important than the fact that it is delivered at all. Bigger sites are capable of delivering biodiversity net gain more easily than smaller sites. So, for example, we have a number of strategic sites across our portfolio that would, by the nature of the fact that they are bigger and have more green spaces, will comfortably achieve more than 10% anyway. And if you were to retrospectively assess many of the strategic sites that have been built over the last 10, 15, 20 years, I'm sure that they would achieve more than 10%. It can be a lot more challenging to deliver that 10% on smaller sites, where effectively if you tried to do it, you would be maybe taking out half the site. And if you took out half the smaller sites that you were trying to deliver, often those would be in urban areas, you'd end up having to deliver a whole load more sites to deliver that housing number. So I think that the key focus here is to make sure that it remains flexible and objective focused, which is to drive up the biodiversity outcomes. And the second thing I think I'd say is a more strategic approach. Biodiversity net gain as a metric is new. We're all adapting to it. I think you've heard from local authorities, industry experts, how difficult it is for them to adapt to it. If we took a more strategic approach where we said, rather than saying we're going to try and do it on every single site that comes forward, there are 7 or 8 places in Wiltshire, for example, or wherever, that we're going to, particularly if it's in the ownership of the public estate when it's controlled, where we're going to really try and make a difference in these locations, and by investing in these locations, by making a payment towards these places, you can achieve a lot more with that scale. And I think that as biodiversity net gain beds in and it becomes par of the course, something that's business as usual, the opportunity to look back at those types of strategies is important. If you look back, say, 10, 15 years, many local authorities were preparing green infrastructure strategies, which sought to link up strategic landscapes, strategic river corridors, strategic things that were important to that place. And it's easy to lose sight also of what you can do on site. So, for example, there are places where we have used hedgerows instead of walls, for example, which help to get that biodiversity throughout the development, and street trees.
Yeah. I think, we've heard as a committee quite a mix of views on whether, on the BNG hierarchy, and you've kind of both highlighted the challenges of what the preference should be for on-site versus off-site. So just wondering, kind of, in your view, what which side of the argument is kind of best on that. Well, you know, and what's your kind of view on that? And like, which is better, really? Because we've heard conflicting.
Both and neither, I would say. Both and neither.
Yeah,
so
okay.
it depends on the site. So if you've got a big site which is capable of delivering biodiversity net gain on site, not only could it do that, but it could also be a receptor site for sites that struggle to do that. With smaller sites, and dare I say, sort of where Ashley and Berkeley tend to do most of their work in the urban environment, I imagine that's going to be more challenging for them. And therefore a strategic solution that helps with the cities, even if they're not within that city but nearby, it is a more effective way of ensuring that you're able to do that whilst continuing to deliver on the balance of other objectives, policy objectives that the government's trying to deliver.
And just thinking about the 10% target, have any of you got an example of where you've gone beyond that target, and why would you want to adopt a wider policy on trying to get to 15 or 20% on sites? And if yes, what was your experience? And if no, what's preventing you from being a bit more ambitious?
So, a couple of sites, but our first biodiversity net gain was down in Kidbrooke Village, basically at Cater Park in Greenwich. We got the Sir David Attenborough Award from Landscape Institute for it. We achieved a 99% biodiversity net gain there. But I think the point I was making earlier is that the 99% was probably as far as we could go with local species and tying into what was local. But actually, the 99% is above. Depends what the baseline is.
Yeah.
So as I said, you can have a 20% net gain on one site and a 99 on the other, and they're the same. Or the 20% could be higher than the 99% because it's all about the baseline.
Do you think that's 10% is too much of a blunt instrument then? And
yes, I think it probably is. But I think the industry is getting used to it at the moment. So I think it's a case of doing what you can to do the best you can on site within the red line, and that's the hierarchy. You start on site. You only go off site if you absolutely need to.
Either of the other witnesses got examples?
Yeah, we've got a site in Buckinghamshire, which was actually submitted before the requirement to deliver biodiversity net gain at 10% came in, and we've delivered 23% against the habitat requirement and 39% against the hedgerow requirement. It is still relatively new, so we don't actually have any sites that have got planning consent since the regulations came in where we've committed to it. We were involved in the pilot scheme in Warwickshire, the site south of Coventry, where we have committed to the delivery of biodiversity net gain through that, and that is being implemented as we speak. It's been a positive example. We had a similar, another site in the same location where we did it off-site, which was a more urban environment within Warwick. And it speaks to that point I was making earlier on, that both on and off-site biodiversity net gain gets you to the same place. And the more prescriptive that regulation is, the harder it is to achieve it. So it can be done. We have done it. I think the key thing about the percentage that we're focusing on at the moment is to walk before we can run. We don't have many examples where it's been implemented. We know that local authority resources to deal with this are limited. Let's get ourselves to a position where we understand what we're delivering, and then if we think that viably an increase can be accommodated at some point in the future, then I think that's a conversation for some point in the future. But we are not yet walking. And the credit market around biodiversity net gain credits is very much in its infancy, and we are all feeling our way through it, and it's not very comfortable, and it's another layer of complexity within a very complex situation already.
Appreciate that. It's very new, but do you think there's any other environmental actions developers could be taking before relying on BNG? And what impact as well is, if any, is BNG having on adherence to mitigation hierarchy?
Yeah, look, as I said earlier in the introduction, we are very used to delivering biodiversity enhancements and improvements. And going right back to the very beginning of my career at Wiltshire and Swindon again, there were policies at that time to enhance the ecological environment alongside. It's not a new concept, and we are doing it. And I could list off a dozen sites here where we are achieving that now. I think the fact that I won't do that. I think the fact that we now have a metric that we're working towards, which provides objectivity around that, it is helpful. And actually, I think that objectivity would be helpful around social gain as well, because schools, community centres, all the other things that are delivered through development, it's very difficult to say this is the benefit that you've had, and a standard method that we can all adhere to is welcomed.
Probably for a different committee, I think.
Probably.
On those. Mrs. Spearing, anything on that final point about adherence to the mitigation hierarchy?
Yeah, absolutely. We would follow the mitigation hierarchy. You know, we always start with an ecologist. We start with an assessment before we go into planning. And you know, if we, and actually, you know, in terms of the cost of biodiversity net gain, if you plan it in early, if you're landscape led with your master plan, then you can do it without cost. It's just about getting the timing right. And then also, you know, I remember there was a question earlier in terms of the cost to residents. If you can plan it in with the managing agent early, it's really an education piece in terms of how you work with biodiversity net gain on sites long term once they're occupied.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie Buckley.
Thank you. Just touching on the issue of cost, I wonder if you could start, Mr. Spearing, by telling us what are the financial implications of BNG on developers and how are they responding?
Certainly for us on brownfield, we are finding that if you consider it early, so you have a landscape-led master plan, you think about ecology early, you think about those local networks, then it's more about planning and getting in early, considering it early. So if you do it efficiently, I don't think there is a cost to it, and actually that it can add a lot of value in terms of, you know, the community that you want to create, in terms of the homes that you want to sell, that you're connecting people, you know, with nature. I think after the pandemic, we thought that being close to open space, nature, you know, was great for health and well-being. So we think it's a really, really positive thing for our communities.
Very positive reply. We often hear sometimes this is called a tax on developers. I wonder what you think, Mr. Duncan. Is this BNG a tax, or how do you factor in the price?
As a matter of fact, it's not a tax because it's not collected by HMRC, but it does cost on smaller sites. I think Ashley's right. On bigger strategic greenfield sites, as I've said on a number of occasions, biodiversity and ecological enhancements form part of the placemaking approach to big strategic sites. We would have been doing this anyway. Ecological and landscape management plans exist.
Can I just press you on that, conscious of time? Do you have any particular recommendation about how we could help smaller sites if they're struggling with these costs?
I was just going to come on to that. When you're into smaller sites, you're into credits. And I think Crest is probably the best person to talk to the impact on SMEs. But credits vary pretty widely in terms of the type of habitat that you're mitigating and the geography that you're mitigating it in. So the credit market at the moment is operating anywhere between £20,000 and £50,000 of credit. And you could need 6, 10, 15 credits. And if you look at the statutory providers, so the government, if the government does it, it's anywhere between 40 and 125,000 of credit, unless you're taking water out of commission, in which case it's £650,000 of credit. So if you are doing small scale development, it is a cost, and it's a question of the planning balance and the policy priorities at any one time. In terms of, we're delivering a lot of things. We're delivering infrastructure, we're delivering schools, we're delivering affordable housing, we're delivering ecological enhancements and biodiversity improvements, we're mitigating the impact on water environments. There's a finite amount that development can afford to fund, particularly where development is not the only contributing factor to the fact that these things are in the state that they are in. And
are you suggesting a higher level for the credits on smaller sites as an incentive?
No, not necessarily. I think, in fact, not at all. I think we need to let this situation bed itself in, and then maybe in a year or two's time, once we see where the biodiversity net gain regime has landed, then to reflect on the learnings and experience from the same group of people that you've been speaking to here.
Excellent, thank you, Chair.
Very much, Blake Stevenson.
I have some questions on placemaking, if I may. So the broad question is, how do we ensure that social and environmental considerations are embedded and they're central to the design of developments and not treated as an add-on? And then, just in the interest of time, the second part of the question is slightly narrower, which is about sort of car dependency. with current designs and current approaches, are we sort of locking in car dependency into new developments? And what can we do to improve that? What are the barriers to improving active travel in our modern communities? It's a question for everybody, but perhaps I can start with you, Mr. Duncan.
Yeah, I mean, that second question you could have an entire inquiry on its own. Embedding biodiversity, net gain and ecological enhancements and green infrastructure into placemaking is already happening. So if you were to speak to any reputable architect about how they go about planning a place, they will map out the constraints, they will map out the opportunities. The constraints and the opportunities are often the same thing. They're the ecological and environmental constraints. We talk about green grids, we talk about ensuring that there's a strong green corridors within and through strategic development areas, but those are on the strategic sites. I think when you're looking at the smaller sites, and even with the strategic sites too, it's also about how you connect back into the place. So if you're on the edge of a big settlement, what biodiversity assets are there, what corridors are there, what parks are there, how do you connect into them, can you enhance them if they're not at the level that you want them to be? So that's how you would go about that. In terms of car dependency, the planning system is all about getting the balance between economic, environmental and social outcomes. And the principle that you direct the majority of your development to the places that already have the infrastructure, including the transport infrastructure, is a well-established principle of planning going back to 1949. The Green Belt has served as a perversion of that objective for a long time. And what I mean by that is the starting point for where you put development should be in the locations that it is most accessible and most sustainable and most capable of taking advantage of existing transport hubs. Often that the elevated status of the Greenbelt has meant that development is being directed beyond the Greenbelt to less sustainable locations such as the ones you mentioned.
So are you arguing that we should have more density in towns and cities around infrastructure and less building in greenfield sites, which is what your company is doing?
That is already government policy and has been through successive governments for 20, 30, 40 years. Ashley, I'm sure, would say, yeah, you should be loading the density up in the urban areas, and I would agree. And I would say that as you get towards the edge of settlements, that you need a proportionate density that fits with the character of that area. I think the point I was more getting at was it's better to release sites that don't perform particularly well in the Green Belt. And by that I mean it's not causing two places to merge with one another, it's not causing a huge amount of urban sprawl, it's not threatening the character of a historic town. It's more sustainable, often, to deliver development adjacent to a place like Bristol, for example, than it would be to jump to the settlements beyond the Greenbelt in North Somerset or South Gloucestershire or Bath and North East Somerset, where the transport connections are not as good, simply not as good.
Ashley, sorry, Mr. Spearing.
So I think Kenny touched on a bit about brownfield there. I think brownfield sites close to transport, close to existing infrastructure, those are the sites that have the biggest impact on growth in the UK. And I think the point I think you were going to is that we need to make the best use of those sustainable brownfield sites. So if they are close to transport, we need to absolutely not lose an opportunity to make the best use of those sites to deliver as much housing as we can, deliver as many homes as we can on brownfield in our towns and cities. Do you want me to talk about your parking question?
Yes, please. Yeah.
So I think it's a similar answer. As close to transport as possible. The majority of our sites are within 12 to 15-minute walk of a transport hub, and then you can have minimal car parking. So I think that is our focus.
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the value of placemaking and creating great towns and cities is sometimes underplayed in the planning system, and trying to work out why that is quite a complex question. We once engaged a Scandinavian architect who was baffled that we the first part of the planning application is to draw a red line around the bit of land that you own and look within it, and that connection beyond it to other parts of the city doesn't always have the sort of emphasis that perhaps it deserves in order to create a truly connected placemaking piece. So I think that's an interesting one to ponder. I don't quite know the answer to that, but I think certainly in our experience we try to placemaking is really key to the value creation. It's how we differentiate the product. It's how we really create social cohesion. We create great places for biodiversity that we've just been talking about. We create great environments for people. So I think that's really for us is critical. And the bit that I suppose is that is out with our control. We talk about some of the social infrastructure pieces, things like schools and healthcare, things that aren't necessarily at a certain scale of development within our gift, trying to get those delivered hand in glove with the development of housing. And it's a little chicken and egg, because you have to have the demand to make the business case for the school in that example. And we've got challenges on a live site at the moment where we are building family houses in a city centre for the first time in 100 years, and that's coming before the primary school that doesn't currently exist. But you can't create a new market for housing for families without that. So I think there needs to be a bit better connection in that respect. In terms of car dependency, I think this is probably the single biggest challenge that we have. It's a deep cultural issue, and I agree that you could spend a whole session talking about cars and car parking, car ownership. But 40% of our towns and most of our new developments are taken up by cars or car infrastructure, and that's a staggering statistic when you look at it nationally. And there is another way, but it does require us to decouple the traditional model that we have, that a house has a car parked outside of it, or every dwelling needs a certain number of cars, and that's a very very nuanced, because it depends on regionally the access to transport infrastructure, etc., where these locations, what the location you're talking about. But we certainly give an invitation to people to travel in the places that we build, and we're certainly very conscious of that you're locking in that transport behaviour for many decades to come. So if you're putting a car outside a house or outside an apartment block, then the invitation is to use that car. But if you're putting in some great walkways, some places that feel very safe, cycling infrastructure, etc., then that can happen. But that requires the link beyond your own red line to make that joined up and worthwhile of being used.
If I have time to just ask one further question on placemaking, if there are one or two things that you wanted to see in the planning and infrastructure bill that aren't there, but if they were there, they would improve placemaking and improve the development of communities, not just housing estates. What would you like to see in that bill? Maybe since you're there, Mr. Thompson, maybe we'll start with you.
Well, I think it would be just raising the standard of design, that actually each site is valued on its own merits, and it takes into account the infrastructure, the amenities that are there locally, and is a proportionate and appropriate response to that. So I think connecting that would be my recommendation.
Thank you. Mr. Spearing?
Yeah, just to answer that in two ways, really. In terms of getting local support from communities for new developments, I think this is where the use of Section 106 rather than SIL can be very helpful in terms of garnering local support. So local people know where the contributions are going and on what infrastructure they're going on, and is it the infrastructure that local people want. In terms of how you embed a new community with an existing community, for the last 10 years we've been using community plans. So before a planning application goes anywhere near a planning committee, we get to know the local community, we find out what they think the community needs, what would serve a new community and the existing community, and what would integrate the two. And then we follow those through multiple phases as we're building a new community and we're integrating those two new communities. And then we use that all the way through into placekeeping effectively, so placemaking to placekeeping. And really that becomes a way of sort of stewardship to make sure that you get that integration between new and old communities. And I think that approach should hopefully get more local support for new development. Quite often we hear communities would otherwise say this development isn't for me, there's nothing in it for me. So I think that would give a bit more local ownership to new communities and new master plans. Are you
saying you think that would be achieved through the current planning and infrastructure bill, or there needs to be change to achieve your brilliant idea?
It's something that we do, and it gets good results. So I just think that more integration, more community engagement early, and the use of Section 106. So
can be done already.
It can be done
if developers want to.
Yes,
Mr. Duncan.
Yeah, I think you sort of Crest and Berkeley are two companies that have placemaking in their DNA. So it's easy for us to sit here and say making good places is easy, because it's sort of what we're all about. But the proposition to bring national development management policies into play so that there's a consistent playing field for everyone, alongside proportionate, and I do mean not going too far here, design codes which set the expectations and requirements for a local area. I think it's very difficult for national policy to impose design standards on places from Westminster when the people who know and understand those places are the people who live in them. The policy tools are already there to do that. I think national development management policies will assist. But I think one of the great tragedies of the loss of planning resource in the last 10 years has been so many of the skills that were in the public sector have vanished, in terms of knowing what they're looking at, knowing how to negotiate, knowing how to ask, knowing how to defend, knowing what good looks like, knowing how to press, knowing how to challenge, and knowing when they've reached the point where that is that. So training and skills, I think, for the public sector, as well as additional public sector resource, is the biggest benefit that you could deliver in terms of trying to achieve a step change in design. Whether or not the design is that bad or perceived to be that bad, I would challenge. I think often the thing that is pointed at with house builders is that standard house types are used again and again and again. But many of the most cherished and valued places in our society are standard house types. The Victorian Terrace is a standard house type. The semis are standard house types. The Bath Crescent is a standard house type. I don't think it's about house types. I think it's about all the components of what makes a place, much of which are in the public realm, and investing in understanding how to compose a street, how to compose a community, how to involve the community in the construction of that process, to involve them in that process. These tools are all available. What we lack is the skills and resource to do it anymore.
You, Pippa Halings.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take us back to the question of balance between house building and nature restoration. And we've heard about biodiversity net gain bedding in, but beyond that, in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, there are proposals for the Nature Restoration Fund and for environmental delivery plans. So I'll take each of those separately, if that's okay. And first of all, in terms of the Nature Restoration Fund, the Office for Environmental Protection is concerned that this could be a regression in terms of the environmental protections that are already in place with existing legislation. And one of the concerns around the Nature Restoration Fund, and we've heard this from other witnesses earlier, is that the conservation measures would come in years after the development impacts have taken place, and often at distance from the protected system network, protected area network that they're taking place in. And so the real question is, could you explain what reasons there could be for developers not being able to have those measures in place before the impacts are fully, felt? Because there's some reason that this is being put in to shift it away from not being upfront, not being agreed, negotiated, and conditional upfront. Is there anything? What is it that would mean that wasn't possible for developers to be able to do that upfront?
So I think developers like control. They like to be in control of their destiny, their investment. So with biodiversity net gain, this is why we like to achieve it on our sites, because then we're in control of it rather than it being off-site and potentially more expensive. And I think it's similar with this point. We're still going to have to deliver the 10% biodiversity net gain, regardless of the Nature Restoration Fund. And we don't know enough about it yet, but I see that this is for strategic issues that are way bigger than any developer can control. So it's things like water and nutrient neutrality, things like that, or issues where you've got a protected species, which covers, 2 or 3 local authorities. So it's almost a fallback plan for those issues, those strategic issues. This shouldn't be used for issues that can be resolved by a developer within their own red line. That's certainly our view.
Can I come back to you on that? So therefore, beyond biodiversity net gain, there will be some of those things that you can deal with, which, as you've said, are ecological enhancements or environmental enhancements. So you still feel that those should happen and should be for the developer to do, rather than all of that being put into the Nature Restoration Fund approach?
If they're things that I can't control. So if there's an issue around, investment into investment into the water infrastructure, that we've seen, maybe the investment hasn't been there the last few decades. It's very difficult for a developer to deal with that on their own. So I think the Nature Restoration Fund should be for larger strategic issues that a developer cannot deal with themselves.
And then what responsibility and accountability would the developer have for their contribution to mediate the impacts of that development?
I think the developer would still pay towards that, but what it does do is for that issue that the developer cannot resolve themselves, it does let them crack on with delivery. There is the mission to deliver the homes, so I think this would work for those strategic issues where the development industry cannot deal with those on their own, and they need broader collaboration across government, water industry, developers, etc.
But there could be an urgency to deal with them, because some of those could be, in terms of value for the area, they could be needed, not in some indeterminate future.
I think the timing is the challenge. So we don't really know how that will work through yet. I don't have an answer on the challenge and how we resolve that timing point.
Okay, and then Duncan, I'll take you because of time. I'll take you on to the next question. But you mentioned how with biodiversity net gain it was good because of the objectivity of it in terms of the goal. The environmental delivery plans, the Office for Environment Protection has said they're concerned about them because they're actually very much open to subjectivity. Would you feel that this could be a blocker in a way because there's so much uncertainty around the way that these are framed at the moment within the planning infrastructure bill? Would this actually sort of could lead to delays?
It's often the case when legislation is introduced that there's not an awful lot of detail and we're all guessing a little bit as to exactly how they'll be implemented, and we are in a similar situation, if I'm honest. But I think we can only say we're supportive of the principle that a more strategic approach to solving major environmental concerns has to be the right way to go. I don't see either the Nature Restoration Fund or the delivery plans being in place to deal with something that we would be expected to deal with, because we could deal with it. It's going to be for issues like water neutrality in Horsham, or it's nutrient neutrality in East Anglia, or the Chiltern Beechwoods recreational impact zone, where development is effectively frozen because there is an environmental offence being committed against the habitats regulations, which the development industry didn't cause and can't solve. So take, for example, the HBF report, which looked at the impact that the entire housing stock has on the nutrient issue, which they estimate to be 5% of the entire housing stock. When you look at the new build housing stock alongside that, the impact that new build housing will be having on nutrient neutrality is pretty small. That's not to say it's not important, and I think the fact that we've got to this situation, and it isn't just these issues, the same applies to traffic assessments when you run out of road capacity. If we plan for capacity to be completely taken up, and then the first drop of whatever it is that comes next bears the full responsibility for the impact it's caused, that is not planning at all, that is reacting. And I think this, since the issue of habitats regulation compliance came up 5-6 years ago, this is the first time there's been any attempt to try and bring together a coordinated response to try and unblock the problem. And it has to be evidence-led and it has to be proportionate. And we will continue to deliver against on a site-by-site basis the biodiversity net gain objectives. and maybe they will or maybe they won't go up in the future, and I'm sure there'll be some teething problems. But when it comes to big, serious national and regional issues like water and nutrient neutrality, that can't be left to the house building sector. That has to be coordinated and controlled by government, the different arms of government, the statutory consultees, the infrastructure providers, the water companies. That's where the solution lies there.
Thank you very much. Martin Rhodes.
Just to actually pick up on that point about nutrient neutrality, and in terms of, are you saying the ways in which local authorities, developers, environmental experts can work together in terms of better to facilitate more housing development while effectively mitigating problems of nutrient pollution?
There are some developers on a small scale have come up with some solutions that get them through, and well done to them. Those are positive environmental outcomes. They often involve retrofitting affordable housing, for example, with pieces of infrastructure that deliver less water. Is that a better outcome? I don't particularly think that it is. I think a strategic outcome that focuses on properly addressing the pollution that exists in these rivers is the right way to go. I mean, take for example a solution that we have managed to identify in a particular location to offset the discharge from those that live in the houses. We've had to take a fish farm out of production. Now, I don't particularly think that in the big picture taking a fish farm out of production is a particularly positive thing for the local area or the country, and maybe it is or maybe it isn't for the farmer. But the only way to address on a strategic scale matters of this significance and importance is for government to take the lead, because although government didn't cause the problem, neither did the house building sector, and so we all have to work together and in partnership to try and find a solution which allows, first and foremost, these degraded environments to be recovered, because that is the objective, but also for the responsibility for that to be evidence-led and proportionate.
Thank you very much. Chris Hinchliffe.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Spearing and Mr. Duncan, the committee has received evidence from Professor Tate at the University of Sheffield and Dr. Chapman at the University of Oxford that the revised presumption in favour of sustainable development is likely to be highly destructive for nature, and that so-called balanced scenarios result in more speculative development on ecologically sensitive land and on more unsuitable sites. That is correct, isn't it?
No.
Okay. Would you like to expand?
The biodiversity net gain legislation ensures that any planning permission that is granted from now on will deliver 10% improvement.
That's a different question to the sustainability and suitability of the site, though.
The answer that I gave earlier on about having checked the number of sites that had been consented and not consented since the 5-year land supply was reintroduced, one of those examples was on the environmental impact. So when it's called the tilted balance. So the tilted balance is the presumption in favour of sustainable development, assuming that all other policies within the National Planning Policy Framework are complied with. If the local authority has not planned for its housing in the right way and has not delivered a land supply that can deliver the housing, then the 5-year land supply allows for the planning inspector or the local authority themselves to consider and assess the weight that should be given to the environmental, social and economic benefits. The way in which that's done and has been done, the only time it hasn't been done recently is in the last 2 years, ensures that if a location is unsustainable, such as 2 of the examples that I gave earlier on, then planning permission will be refused. And that is continuing to happen, both at the local level and with the planning inspectorate.
So the new definition implies that permission will be granted unless it would cut across protections for safeguarded areas like national parks. It doesn't deal with the suitability of a site with regards to access to green space, with regards to car dependency, as we've already discussed. Mr. Spearing, given the widespread proof that we've already heard about before our eyes and in our constituencies that the current presumption in favour of sustainable development is leading to bolt-on estates with many problems associated with them in terms of their wider sustainability, would you agree that to protect the environment we need a clearer definition of sustainable development, for example one that refers to the UN Sustainable Development Goals?
I think up-to-date local plans, which consider where are the right places to build. I think that only strengthens the presumptions we already have, and evidently building on brownfield, close to transport, close to infrastructure, has got to be the most sustainable form of development that we can have.
And with regards to the definition, would you agree that it needs to be tightened in order to ensure that?
I think it already does what it needs to do.
So you wouldn't agree that currently the presumption in favour of sustainable development is causing any of the issues I've just described?
I think brownfield development, nature improvement and environmental resilience and sustainability can go hand in hand.
Okay, I think I've reached the end of that line of questioning, but to move to Mr. Thompson and to pick up on the point around brownfield, we've already heard in this discussion today how successive governments have said they're going to deliver brownfield sites first, which has obvious potential benefits for minimising loss of greenfield habitats, but this has manifestly failed to transpire. What recommendations could this committee put forward to ensure we genuinely secure our 1.5 million homes on a brownfield first basis?
Well, I think there's various regional challenges to do with land economics that are quite different in different parts of the country. But certainly in my experience in Yorkshire, there are areas where there is market failure in that the existing land value for industrial can be higher than one for a residential housing-led scheme. So in those scenarios, I think Homes England have a role to play and do play that role in supporting those viability gaps. And I think the planning has another role to play in just in encouraging and incentivizing those sites to be brought forward. So through a variety of fiscal means, I suppose, and planning tools that are available. So I think some of those things are happening, but it's probably not coordinated, and it's left to individual local authorities who have varying sort of degrees of ambition and of resources to be able to articulate their visions for the particular areas. So in the best examples, I think we're seeing that certainly in places like Sheffield, where the collaboration between the local authority and and Homes England and the mayoral combined authority is really tight, and they're actually able to strategically identify priorities brownfield sites and bring those forwards in partnership with the private sector. And I think there are some really good examples of that working really well. But it isn't across the piece in all local authorities.
Thank you. Mr. Spearing, since your organisation also deals with brownfield law, are there any recommendations you would like to see from this committee to ensuring we genuinely deliver brownfield first?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key one is absolutely prioritising delivery over everything else. If that's the most important thing, is housing delivery. So in our cities, rather than it being maybe how many homes are dual aspect, it might be if we can deliver more good green homes without 100% dual aspect homes, then focus on the outcome, which is more homes. The building safety regulator we talked about, over 18,000 homes currently stuck at Gateway 2 with a building safety regulator that can't start. We need to fund infrastructure investment, in our towns and cities. We need to get the housing associations back on a good place so they can buy the affordable homes. Replacing SIL and using Section 106 instead will give planning authorities a lot more flexibility to make decisions. At the moment, SIL is charged first, affordable housing is the make weight. We want, I think, changing that so local authorities can decide to put affordable housing first and SIL second would be a good way of doing that. More regulatory stability, so not changing rules and regulations and standards and having duplication. So it'll be a lot clearer, and it will incentivise investment from the private sector into the UK. And embracing density close to transport. We've got to make the best use of those brownfield sites because the more we can deliver out of brownfield, the better. So let's not lose any opportunities, and let's do the best we can where we can.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. John Whitby.
Thank you, Chair. Very quickly, what are the biggest barriers to reducing embodied carbon and conducting whole life carbon assessments? I'm happy for anyone to answer that one.
So I think we'll bring Mr. Thompson in first on that if we can.
Well, I think it was mentioned earlier that cement and concrete is the single biggest component of carbon emissions, and I think that's certainly the place to start. But I suppose you can split this into buildings that fall within the Building Safety Act and those that are under 18 metres, and into two camps here. Certainly from our perspective, we've been tracking the embodied carbon against the LETI guide for 2030, and by using timber frame systems, we're actually already far below the LETI guide, and plan to drive that even further. And that technology's there, it's available, and actually we're delivering that at a lower cost than we would a traditional build method now, and that's largely to do with the productivity challenge that exists in construction, which could be a whole other session. So I'll leave that there. But and then the other bit is the buildings over 18 metres, where the embodied carbon is particularly challenging now, because timber or any combustible material, regardless of how it's performing and for fire safety, is outlawed. So you're kind of locked into concrete and cement-based and steel-based products as the primary building material there, and the embodied carbon in those areas is particularly challenging. So as a result of that and other viability, certainly our approach is to change the densification on the sites to create more lower rise buildings and intensify that density at a street level to try and achieve the overall similar sort of density that you would otherwise with a mixture of taller buildings and housing products. So that's certainly where we come at it from. The technology's all there. As I say, it's a case of some of the regulation that is moving around a little bit, but having a focus on it. I think one thing that the future home standard doesn't record is embodied carbon, and I think as soon as you start recording that data and being measured against it, it will start to come down. So there's currently a real focus on operational carbon, which is part of the equation, but the embodied carbon is, by many accounts, actually much more important, because that's the carbon that's being we're incurring right now, rather than over the life of the property.
You think the government should require whole life carbon assessments to be done, or keep it voluntary?
Certainly, an embodied carbon assessment is very easy to do, and that could very simply be done for each property. Whole life carbon becomes a little bit more complicated. But
I'll just ask as well, quickly, because we're against time. Will low carbon homes be more expensive to buy than higher carbon homes? Anyone to
Not to me. No. In short, there's no link between cost and value. The market sets the value of homes, and regardless of how much, how many sustainability, how sustainable, what low carbon technology we build into our properties, the market sets the price. So it potentially affects the cost, but I think that's where I was advocating for a kind of re-engineered model, particularly using MMC, as to how you can actually reduce the cost of low carbon homes as well.
The Future Homes Hub has recently published the Net Zero Transition Plan, and a plea from them is that we need certainty and regulatory consistency on the technical standards that are going to be required to deliver this as soon as possible. Because to embed it in the supply chain needs to know what we're working towards. They need to know that the government are on board and the sector are backing it. So if this is going to be achieved, and it is a hugely challenging target, if it's going to be achieved, we need government and industry hand in glove in making the changes that need to be changed, and that's the key message from them.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Barry Gardner.
First of all, thank you very much, both of you, and also, Chris, to you virtually. First, for your Windsor Gate development, and to you, Mr. Spearing, for your Berkeley Green development, in which you incorporated 50 Swift bricks in the Windsor Gate and 85 in the Berkeley Green. And Mr. Thompson, I understand you have signed up to the pledge and the Homes for Nature pledge to install a Swift brick for every property built, for every new home built. I think Crest has done the same.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that Berkeley Group has, just as I'm not sure that all of the members of this committee have yet signed my early day motion on Swift bricks. 5 have, but I know the culprits. Chair. But great that you've done that. Look, I wanted to ask you a couple of things. First of all, how easy is it? How easy do you find it to work with public bodies? Homes England, Environment Agency, Natural England, and how consistent is the advice that you feel you're getting from them? Chris, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I think we have a very strong relationship with Homes England. I'm aware Homes England operates in a number of different areas, but I think particularly in the area of regeneration and having that public-private partnership really tight and working together to solve problems, we have a very good relationship with them, and they play a pivotal role in unlocking some of the challenging sites. So yes, that's very positive. I think the other services that Homes England can and do deliver to the SME market in terms of funding, where they are to address kind of market failure, we've not used that service for probably best part of 15 years. It could go further, I think, in terms of its appetite for risk. It sort of functions quite similar to a bank, and I think, speaking to Homes England colleagues, they are sort of aware of that and looking to be a bit more bullish in terms of how they can support the SME sector. But yes, generally speaking, excellent relationship with Homes England. Some of the other statutory bodies, it's really on a case-by-case basis, really, in terms of what planning challenges are presented on different sites. But no particular issues.
Okay.
We've got a very good relationship with Homes England in exactly the same way. They are positive, proactive. They help in bringing land
and
to the
in
market.
terms of the consistency of advice that you would get from the Environment Agency or from Natural England?
Mixed. I think it's fair to say, and I think it's important that we are fair here, that Natural England and the Environment Agency don't have the level of resource now that they did 10, 15 years ago, and I think they find it very, very challenging.
They actually have exactly the same resource that they had in 2006 when they were set up.
I did not know that.
So it's,
there's no
with inflation, it's a good deal less than they originally had 21 years ago.
And look, at various stages of my career, I've had regular, consistent meetings with different parts of the statutory consultees, whether it's National Highways, whether it's Natural England, whether it's the Environment Agency. But if you seek pre-application advice from the StatCons, they don't have the resource to give it to you. They are frequently struggle to respond within the statutory timeframes, and it's impossible for a planning authority to make a decision unless the statutory consultees have provided that advice.
So if thinking about the sort of recommendations this committee might wish to make to government, it would be to resource the statutory consultees appropriately in order to make sure that the process is speeded up. If you want to deliver 1.5 million homes in the time frame the government has set out, you can't do it unless you've properly resourced those statutory consultees. Is that right?
Absolutely. And in addition to that, a set of objectives that they're all working towards so that everybody is pointing in the same direction. Those two things. You couldn't do any more to aid the planning process, I don't think, in terms of resource than that.
That's really helpful. Yes, Mr. Spear.
And I'd agree with Kenny's response. I think resource and getting the experience and the resource back into those bodies. In terms of Homes England, absolutely, it's a similar response to Chris. Work in partnership with Homes England to unlock and accelerate delivery where we can. So that works really well.
So, more ecological officers in planning authorities, to help you there, but also proper resource for Environment Agency and Natural Income. Thank you. I want to talk about estate management companies, because you will know that some of the BNG, the maintenance of that, it seems to me that if I were buying a property with one of these net gains in the development, I think, hang on, I'm paying for this twice over, because I'm paying the price of the property, right? But the BNG, the biodiversity net gain, was something that you were responsible for as the developer, and therefore should be contained in the price of the house that I've paid. But now I find some estate management company charging me to maintain it, and I've no idea how they're basing those charges or what they got for it in the first place. Do you think that people are being ripped off in their service charges in that way?
I think if we catch this early enough, so I guess there are not that many projects that have been through net gain and then that be passed into the management company. I think what we're finding is that where we bring an ecologist and the management company together early, it's an education piece about how to manage and maintain. So it doesn't have to cost more. It's just an education piece. So what you may be seeing there is people pricing in risk in terms of not knowing what that management regime is. So I think it doesn't have to cost more. It's an education piece if it's done properly at the right time.
But should the developer, I should say, not set in place a ring-fenced fund for the ongoing management of the biodiversity net gain on site? Because, as I say, it was part of your obligation to in putting your planning application in. It was your obligation to ensure the biodiversity net gain. It wasn't down the line open. It wasn't for the property owner to be then charged an ongoing fee every year for the maintenance of that. So shouldn't you have put that ring-fence fund in the first place?
But if we catch this early and educate the management companies, there should not be a different cost.
It should. Sorry, say that again.
It should cost no more for the purchaser. I just think it's about education.
Well, I agree with you if you get it up front, but it's an unknown cost if you don't, isn't it? Because as a purchaser, I want to know what my outgoings. I can gauge what my electricity is going to be. I can gauge what my gas is going to be, although soon we won't be having it. My water and so on. But what I don't know is what I'm going to be charged in the biodiversity net gain.
Okay, before I worked for Crest, I worked for local government. And when I came into local government, the standard approach, almost universally, was that assets like public open space, green infrastructure, would be transferred to the local authority, and it would be funded through council tax, and it would be maintained in that way. Now, around about the time that I was drifting out of local government, around about the financial crash in 2008, local authorities started to be struggling to resource what they were doing, so that when they were looking forward at a planning consent that was about to be issued, the last thing they wanted was more liabilities when they were struggling to service the liabilities that they had. And so there's been a gradual movement from what was standard accepted practice, which is what you've just described, to where we find ourselves today. And it's a consequence, again, coming back to the point of resourcing and where one wants to prioritise resource. So I think the point that Ashley was making was on a tadpole garden village, on a arbour field, these are big development sites, there is an ongoing management, landscape and ecological management plan that goes with that, and that is already baked into the cost of management and maintenance. And look, there are some really good examples. I'm going to give you a couple. Tadpole Garden Village in Swindon, Monksmoor Park in Daventry. Those are both community interest companies where the community own the asset. They own the asset and do what they like with it. They can raise revenue from it. They can do what they like.
They control the management of it.
And control the management.
And therefore they control the price. But
Correct.
if you look at somewhere like Firstport Management and what they've been doing, as many of this committee have experience of, we have people who are being ripped off.
Yeah. And look, I agree, if the people who are paying for the service don't control the management regime, that is a problem. in my view. That is the view of me, not Crest Nicholson and not the House Building Federation, Home Building Federation. I agree with you. But the principle, if we don't want management companies moving forward to look after public open space and assets like that, is that a different way of doing it has to be identified. Now, the last time I spoke to a council about taking on the management of public open space, the figure I was quoted as a commuted sum was 8 figures, which would have doubled, it was twice again, half as much as the entire Section 106 budget. Now that can't be right. So this needs proper investigation. This is probably not the forum for that conversation.
Frame this, please, if you will, Mr. Duncan, in a recommendation that this committee should be putting into its report to government, because that's where we can actually meet the need that you're expressing.
So the recommendation would be to investigate the regime for adopting public open space within public authorities, to investigate how it's funded, how the method of arriving at the figure is put together, and to consider the appropriate control of the management regime where management companies are put in place. Those are the two things I would recommend.
Thank you. I just wanted to put one more, and it may touch on what you were saying, Mr. Spearing, about early intervention being required here. But you may be aware of a report that was commissioned by Wild Justice, which was carried out in the summer of last year, looking at 42 new developments across 5 local planning authorities to see whether they were complying, the developers were complying with the ecological conditions actually on the ground. And they found that 53% of ecological features that should have been there weren't. What's going on here? Is this simply the lack of enforcement capacity at local authority level so that these are not being monitored properly, and it goes back to the issue of properly resourcing the statutory consultees?
I think I'd start by saying clearly that shouldn't be the case, and it would be the position of the company, the Home Builders Federation, that shouldn't be the case. I don't know the details of that. I haven't seen the report. I can offer you some examples of where sometimes things do go wrong. Often with planting and the requirement for planting, if it's done out of season, if there's a particular environmental event, and it has to be replaced. So there might be some of that. There are occasions where sometimes the management company doesn't quite perform to the standards that they've been procured to do. That can result in...
You're talking about Firstport again?
No, I certainly wasn't. And that can have an impact on the ecological requirements and the strategy. It shouldn't be the case. It absolutely shouldn't be the case. And monitoring moving forward is going to be a method of ensuring compliance with biodiversity net gain requirements, and certainly we would be supportive of that.
What sort of compliance regime do you think would improve that 47% of features not being there? Mr. Thompson, do come in here as well if you feel the urge. No.
No, I've got nothing to add. Thank you.
The existing tools that are there should be enough to deal with this, to be honest with you. I think what you're probably looking at is a dedicated resource within the local authority to pay attention to what's going on and to ensure that these things are being done.
Goes back to what we said about properly resourced.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'll just give Mr. Thompson one final chance. I'm conscious we've heard slightly less from him than others. Are there any specific recommendations you would like this committee to be making, Mr. Thompson, on from your own experience on these issues?
Not that we haven't talked about already during the course of this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Spearing, Mr. Duncan, thank you very much for your evidence. It's been an excellent session, and we're very grateful. Thank you. Order.